Welcome to the PowerPoint presentation for my final research project for Information Resources for Research. In this project, I intend to demonstrate that while mounting societal pressure against South Africa's apartheid-sponsoring regime discouraged many film producers and talents from utilizing the country as a shooting location, the rewards outweighed the risks for enough low-budget filmmakers to continue utilizing the cheap resources that the country had to offer. It was only a combination of societal pressure and increasingly restrictive tax codes that caused the country's film boom to end. The first part of my research paper will concern a history of the country of South Africa and its film culture to give the reader a sense of context for the argument. I'll be starting out with a history of the country and an explanation of apartheid, the racial segregation system South Africa's National Party set up in 1948 that lasted until 1994. I'll go into greater detail in the paper, obviously, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll let this fine gentleman explain some of the reasons behind the fact that the white minority set up the system of segregation to remove the non-white and majority residents from their homes, deprived them of citizenship, and given lesser education, medical care, and countless other public services.
Is a lesser state of development is by far in the majority here. And numerically, of course, they are much stronger. And because also I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved. And also everything we have done in the last 300 years and built up in the church and in the state should be preserved and not be swallowed up by an, I wouldn't say inferior race, because I don't believe it is an inferior race, but a lesser a race which is in a lesser state of development, that's all.
He seems like a peach. I'll then move on to the international response to apartheid practices prior to 1985, including the academic boycott of the 1960s and various precursors to the stronger cultural boycott of the country, including Dusty Springfield's refusal to play the country if black residents could not be sold tickets.
You do have this special anti-apartheid clause written into your contract. Do you feel strongly politically about this?
No, I don't know the first thing about politics. All I know is that I think that there shouldn't be anybody, if they want to buy a ticket, should be allowed to do so. And this was the agreement I went under. And sorry.
Why was your contract different to previous ones? It was much stronger.
Well, I think that I may be wrong about this, but I think that in the case of most British artists who've been there before, they have played maybe one or two segregated concerts. And I didn't particularly want to do that.
Finally, I'll examine a brief history of the South African film industry up until 1985, taking a brief look at the films that had been made in the country up to that point. Next, I'll take a look at the films themselves and the financial reasons that South Africa became such a boom for the film industry in the 1980s. I'll research the tax code changes that allowed for films to get plenty of money back from the government, along with the fact that costs of hiring South African cast and crew were significantly lower than hiring the same teams in the United States or Europe. So what exactly are the films to examine in this context? I'll be using the term Zaxploitation films to note the genre, a combination of South Africa's country code of ZA with the term exploitation describing most low-budget genre films. While the definition generally includes any exploitation film made in South Africa, I am concentrating on the films produced in the country or with South African funds meant for an international audience. These are films that populated the video store shelves of the late 80s and early 90s all over the globe, made by independent filmmakers for as large of an audience as possible. They're thrillers, action films, horror movies, and science fiction epics made in the country because it was cheap to film there. While independent genre films had been made in South Africa for years, the late 80s represented a huge uptick in both the film's creation and the cultural opposition to the country's apartheid practices. So what's out of the equation? Films made in South Africa meant for the white South African audience, films made in the country addressing apartheid directly and often coming under considerable scrutiny from the government, and films in the Zulu language usually very cheaply shot for the country's large black population. Closing this section, I'll look at the way these South African productions were disguised by producers to look as though they were shot in other countries, ranging from fictional countries in Africa,
At the same time, it will will supply our national industries with the power they require to turn our country into a supplier of high-quality manufactured products for the entire world.
If you look out your windows,
To small town USA,
beautiful downtown Hicksville.
Borden.
Showers around South Florida.
to significantly larger town USA,
Partly cloudy, the forecast, and a slight chance of some showers. High of 82, 63 degrees now, Miami. West.
Is what the doctors call
And beyond.
insanity. For what could be more criminally insane than to bite the hand from which all blessings flow?
In the next section, I'll be examining the societal response to apartheid in the 1980s, which resulted in increasing government intervention and sanctions against the country, and members of the artistic community increasingly reluctant to have their products associated with the racist policies, as best evidenced by the controversial 1985 protest song Sun City, which caused quite an issue with those musicians still lending their talents to the locale.
I think that anybody that has played there, I don't want to... Actually, I won't mention names. Rod Stewart and Queen and people like that have played there. They're jerks for doing it, and they were more than aware of what they were doing, and I think that they should be called out for it.
I'll be going into detail about the increasing social pressure to have governments discourage apartheid, resulting in increased sanctions and more people less willing to work in the country. Lastly, I'll be taking a close look at Red Scorpion, the 1988 Dolph Lundgren movie that served as a tipping point for the cultural boycott of South Africa. Co-written and produced by lobbyist Jack Abramoff, the anti-Soviet film utilized South African resources and was filmed in the South African-occupied Namibia. When these connections were revealed and protests against the film began, the film lost its studio distributor and was barely released. I'll conclude the paper with a brief segment on South African film after apartheid, noting the changes made since then, and mentioning that cultural boycotts can have an impact, however small, on societal change. My bibliography is in several parts, as I'll be using a combination of scholarly sources, news sources, autobiographical material and interviews, as well as the films themselves. This represents a look at the type of scholarly sources I'll be using from periodicals about South African film industry and the cultural responses to apartheid. I'll also be using full books as research materials, though in most cases only a few paragraphs from a several hundred-page book will be of any direct use. I'll also be using a variety of news sources from magazines and periodicals that covered various aspects of my research in order to get specific dates, names, and figures. In addition, I'll be utilizing reviews of the films themselves as sources, as they often contain information about how the film is disguised as being of non-South African origin, sometimes even fooling the writer. Note the review of Sweet Murder above, which identifies the film as Australian. It's not an uncommon mistake, as the accent of white South Africans is sometimes mistaken for an Australian one. Lastly, I'll be utilizing the films themselves as sources for information. Not only the Zaxploitation films I'm researching, but a pair of documentaries on South African film and exploitation film as well, as both intersect nicely with my subject matter. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this preview of a coming attraction to the feature presentation that will be my research paper. Roll credits, even if they happen to be falsified ones that imply the whole film was shot in Florida.